morning, everyone. So I think we'll need you on stage now, Carl, if you don't mind. So before giving you this medal, I think the best thing we can do to introduce your your talk, is to read the testimonial that Asher Shepard prepared for you. So we are going to read that together. So how does this work? Press the next button. Here we are. So, Carl. The board of directors of the Bioelectromagnetic Society takes a great pleasure in awarding the D'Arsonval Award Medal to you, Dr. Carl Blackman, whose creativity and accomplishments opened new windows for the discipline of bioelectromagnetics, whose careful array of frequencies, orientation, and strength-based cells with electromagnetism time to calcium faint hold on the molecule of life, who, with the least of a joule, revealed parameters of magnetism nonlinear play with living matters. Inspiring colleagues the world over by his energy, vision, and commitment, drawing ideas from deep wells and enthusiasm from youth-sustaining springs. Carl led this society as its president, board member, editorial board member, brought to print the history of its first quarter century, serving BIOEMS tirelessly since its inception. With delight in recognizing his enduring accomplishments, warm and ever-pleasant manner, integrity, and high standing among colleagues, we, assembled in Cape Town, South Africa, for the 36th annual meeting of the Society, proudly confer this highest honor in bioelectromagnetics this day, the 9th of June in the year 2014. So please join me to applaud Carl. And congratulations. So Carl, you're going to receive this very nice document, and I'm going to show it to you while you're preparing for your presentation, because the floor is yours now. This is a piece of document.
So this will all show up. Yes, I can see. All right. This is fairly simple. They're just two arrows. Well, this is the title of my presentation, and the only I just want to talk about the various influences on me by a number of different circumstances, and I decided I'd stay with C's, courses and chiefs and colleagues and collaborators and critics and circumstances, conundrums and cash, and then some other things as well. The thing I want to point out on this is that I'm identifying my home address because I decided to retire from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and so I'm no longer a U.S. government employee, and that happened on the last day of work was 3rd of April. All right, so let me go to the next slide, okay, because this is the pre-introduction, which I want to thank bioelectromagnetics officials for honoring me with this award. I did not expect it, and I'm happily accepting it, but only because it's on behalf of all of the people who've contributed to the work that we've done together. If I've missed anyone, and in fact this morning I added another person, anyone who has contributed, I apologize in advance. So here is the outline of my presentation. This is what I intend to discuss, and I'll be available all week if anyone wants to discuss anything else. And first is to describe the influences that caused my research career to take the trajectory that it did, because it certainly wasn't a straight and narrow path. And I hope this information will be useful for young investigators, because as your careers develop, you can have discouraging circumstances and you just have to work around them. And then at the very end, I want to identify an issue of importance to me that I think is yet to be fully examined by bioelectromagnetics research. So first, the courses. In graduate school, I was a physics major in undergraduate school, so when I went to graduate school, I had to take some classes, one in biology, and it was sort of a revelation when I found out in 1964 that microbiology could be very precise in detecting which out of 10 to the 6th base pairs would cause a mutation, whereas physics had just electron microscope to look at, and you're not going to pick it up at that time. And then another aspect, I took a course in electron spin resonance, and that gave me a sensitivity for looking at patterns. And I think that's progressed throughout the experience that I've had with in my research career. And let's see, biophysics involved mixing the physics and the biology. And in my research in graduate school, sometimes the biological responses led the experiment and mechanistic interpretation. So you didn't always have to start with biology and just prove it start with physics and prove it with biology. So for the chiefs, here's a history. When I joined the federal government, I joined the Bureau of Radiological Health, and whoops, I'm doing the same thing that, okay. I joined the Bureau of Radiological Health, and Bill Leach was my supervisor. And they had just finished looking at color television sets and deciding that they had to make a regulation in the United States to put more lead in the screens of the front of the color television sets, because you had 3 guns shooting electrons at the front rather than only one. And so now they were going to look at microwave ovens. And my job was to see whether it caused the leakage from microwave ovens caused any mutations. So he gave me a book which was a report of a committee that Steve Cleary had done on a panel that he had in his university. And so I took 2 weeks to look through it, and I came back to my branch chief and I said, I don't think you have to worry, because there's not enough energy in the photons of the microwaves to cause any bonds to break. And that should be a classical thing that we've heard on and on and on. And I stated that to Bill. And he just said, well, that's good, all right, in his wise way. And he said, but, it's our job to prove that. So I thought, all right, I've just joined the federal government. Now I realize that we're not out just for new discoveries. We have to work on public health. Well, within 3 months of that, the Environmental Protection Agency was created, and I was put into EPA. And my next supervisor was Dave Janes. And we had to get this new agency organized, and so most of my time was spent with John Alice, working with Dave on policy documents. And we even did some millimeter wave work that was Sidney Webb had published in Nature, and so we tried to repeat that, and we weren't very successful. And then we had to move we consolidated from Rockville, Maryland, where we were at a very nice metropolitan area, down to Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, which was really out in the country. That's a nice thing I could say about it. And down there, one of my chiefs had made a major impression on how to deal with people. Was Dan Cahill. He led a broad interdisciplinary research program. We had 28 people, including 12 PhDs. And he supported the research fairly. He was dictatorial, but very pleasantly dictatorial. There was no, it was very reasonable what he had done. And he made decisions where he didn't necessarily have to understand all of the scientific justifications. We did well there, and then he retired, and Joe Elder became acting division director for a while, and then they hired Richard Phillips to come in. Both of these supervisors were excellent, but unfortunately they were operating under circumstances where our funding decreased, and it ceased on the end of February of 1986. No more funds, and these managers couldn't resuscitate it. So then what happened is that the whole division was broken down, and I had to join another division. So I joined one that was involved with cancer research, and Mike Waters and Larry Claxton were supervisors. And they allowed me to seek and ultimately accept DOE support so that I could start to do electromagnetic fields again, because for 2 years, everything was cut off. And I underline ultimately because I went to DOE, and the first time the manager of DOE really didn't want to talk to me. He didn't like EPA. But luckily he retired, and so things happen that are good. And a new head of the research group at DOE was willing to listen to people. And so he invited 3 folks to go to Washington, D.C. to make presentations. And so I went, and there were 3 of us, and 2 people got awards, and they were Abe Liboff and Robert Liberty, and I didn't get any money. So that's all right. You know, I had an opportunity, and you just have to live with that. And a year later, I had a phone call from this man, Emery Jouk. And he said, "Carl, do you still have that 1-pager you wrote describing the research you want to do?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, we want to fund that. Why don't you just send that up?" And so that's how I got my funding. So just when everything looks bleak, it's not necessarily that way. Just have a positive attitude and be ready to take available the opportunities that suddenly occur. There was another time during this, I had 2 5-year interagency agreements to determine, but I had to justify it in a way that said that I used it to, I said that I'm using it to try to understand how chemicals interact with biological systems which are of EPA interest. And that was a little bit of a twist, but it was acceptable to my laboratory director. And yet my laboratory director told me, "But remember, you are forbidden to study health effects of EMF," which is quite telling. I haven't interpreted it yet, but I think that you could make a number of interpretations. And then one time in 1996, my immediate supervisors, who were different at the time, decided they were not going to let me take the research anymore. And Larry Ryder came to my rescue again, and he convinced his subordinates, who were my supervisors, to allow us to continue the work. So now I'm going to switch to colleagues, and here are 4 slides on colleagues. One was with the people in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. On the top, you see John Alice and Joe Alley and the series of names across the top. And this is the group that Dan Cahill led. And when I say formal, informal practicing for presentations, we would have to have our presentations ready to present 3 weeks before going to a meeting. And we all got together for a whole day in a room, and we went through people's presentations, and one after the other. And after the second year of doing this, we all recognized that we didn't want to be first anymore. Because for a 12-minute presentation, it was 45 minutes of discussion of what should be improved on that. And then it got shorter and shorter and shorter as we went through the rest of the day. And those of us who went first were delighted that we didn't have to go again. But it was enormously enlivening of the vitality of the program. And so some of these scientists up here are also co-authors. And the person I added this morning, which was a real omission until then, was a statistician who was not part of the research group, but Dennis House was actually instrumental in me designing research. Well, he designed it with me so that we had statistically significant work to present. And then, of course, the technical support staff who actually does the work in the laboratory. We had electronics and machine shops that were superb, and even the graphics group was very high quality. So we had all these support people, and if I didn't have those, I wouldn't be in front of you. I mean, it just is not my work exclusively. Now, colleagues outside of EPA, in the rest of the U.S., and I may have missed people here, but certainly Ross Adey, Suzanne Baywin, Asher Shepard, and Chris Kane from Adey's group were very important in interaction, discussion. Abe Liboff, he and I would get on the phone and talk for hours about speculation. It was just wonderful. Robert Liberty was part of the DOE group who I was asked to see if I could repeat his work with MCF7 cells. And he was very cooperative with that, and we were able to do that. And then I've always had good interactions with Frank Barnes and Ben Greenebaum, and I think they're continuing to try to contribute by expanding the concepts that you can apply, you can devise in physics to see whether you can explain some of the issues that we've observed that need to have explanation, which you will see later on. And then in Europe, one of the first, I underline Alessandro Chiabrera. And I underline his name because I won a talk-off. We had 3 people who wanted to go to a 1979 meeting just outside of Paris, and only one of us could go. And so the research group voted on who should go. Dan Cahill said, okay, let's take a vote. And I won, so I had to present Ralph Smilowitz's talk and Jim Kinn's poster. But I presented my own work, which was the first attempt at replication of Suzanne Baywin's work. And after I made the presentation, we walked back. We all ate at a dining area on a campus. And this guy comes running up with me with a whole group of people behind him. And he says, I want to talk to you about this. This is interesting. And he said, have you tried this? If you're thinking about doing that. And this was Alessandro. And I thought, who is this guy? No, he is inside my brain. Now, let me take a stop and say what I had done is when I first repeated the work from Suzanne Baywin, I saw some things that I thought might be wrong. And so we went ahead and explored some things. That there were the widths of the intensity window were broad, and then they got narrower when my statistician said, no, do it, this is a better way to do it. And I thought, there's something going on here that I don't understand, and so we need to explore it further. And we were also working on the biochemistry of what's going on in the medium and so forth, so that I had data already that I could present the next year. So I knew that what I was presenting then was work that would stand up. And I think sometimes people present work too soon, and they need to explore what the consequences are to see if they really do work. I know that there's also a lot of pressure to publish as soon as you can because you've got to be first. But Alessandro and I subsequently had a lot of interaction along with Guglielmo, and they were very supportive of work with trying to understand what was happening with this ion paramagnetic resonance, because we had a heuristic model, and they were trying to work it out. And then there's some others here, Ingeva and Shell and Jacob and Igor are also offered a lot of insightful support for us. I had 2 postdocs that came to my laboratory, and they had their own research project from Spain, and Jocelyn Leal and I were we're very friendly. And so she said, this would be a good place for them to go. And they got their own money from the Spanish NIH, whatever the equivalent is. And when they got to there, I said, well, you can do the research plan that you have, but we have just found that gap junction communication might be able to be changed by EMF. Would you like to look at it? And I said, well, yes. And so they undertook that work, and then they also undertook work with hydrogen resonance, which I'll show you a slide of that, and then they continued the testing to look at the effect of melatonin, because we had also discovered that melatonin was involved. And so the last thing on the very bottom here of the slide are three things that I think you all should know in case you don't. And that is that we discovered with Alex and Angeles that our incubators had 2-pole motors rather than 4-pole motors when we got new incubators. Because we had an old incubator which had a heater that went on and off, and we had a motor in that, and we all were using that one incubator until we got the new ones in. And the results were fine, but when we went to the new incubators, the results were all distorted. So first thing was we looked at the ambient AC fields in the incubator, and in fact they were, rather than 2 or 3 milligauss, they were, I'm sorry to use these old terms, but that's what I remember, 2 or 3 milligauss up to 300 milligauss when you had the 2-pole motor. So we got 4-pole motors and put them in, and the fields went down. But then we also noticed something else was strange on this response to hydrogen resonance, and that was that that it looked like the heater was involved, because in the old incubator, the heater either went on or off, and so what you had is you had a pulsing of the heat in the incubator. But in the new incubators, the pulsing was much finer. Right? Well, what they started doing was chopping the sine wave that went into the heater. So now you had more frequencies in there. And here's where we adopted a system that Robert Liberty had designed, which was to use mu metal boxes in the incubator. When we did that, the data settled back to what we could get in the old incubator. So nowadays we've just had to replace in January, when I still thought I'd be working for a year. We had an incubator that the motor died, and we tried to get it replaced. It turns out, at least in the US, the only motors you can buy are 2-pole motors. So that means a lot of AC fields in the incubators. And I insisted on getting 4-pole motors. And they can find some, but then they had to modify the brackets so they would fit. So I just mention that because if you get effects in one incubator and not in the other, don't blame the cells. They might be the incubators. The last thing was, we also were doing work where I would set up the exposures for my technician, and then Alex and Angeles would set up theirs. And so I did this one time at 11:30 in the morning. I was finished. I told my technician I'm ready. And Alex and Angeles were also using the same Hall effect probes, I should say fluxgate probes. And they set up theirs, and they started their experiments. And when I came back, my technician said, Carl, I haven't had a chance to get to it yet, so I'll do it at 3 o'clock. And so I thought, all right, at 2:30, I'll measure them again. So I went out and measured them again, and the DC field had changed by 10%. It went from 360 milligauss, 365 up to 404. And I thought, well, this can't happen. But this is a Hall effect probe. I mean, a fluxgate. This is not a Hall effect where you bend the wire and it will move all over the place. And so we spent a substantial amount of time trying to find out what was happening. I thought, well, they were changing equipment in the ceiling and the roof somewhere, heavy motors or downstairs. Nothing, absolutely nothing. And the only thing that we can figure is that this is when the building was an office building originally, and so there was not enough air conditioning. So as the summertime came, they would turn on the switches. And when we looked, the next day we looked at it, and the incubator that I was using was very close to a circuit breaker. All right? Now, Alex's was about 6 feet away, parallel on the outside wall. Angelus's was about 10 feet away. Oh, the heck. Alex's had a 7 milligauss change, and Angelus's had less than a 1 milligauss change. So that sort of centered it down to the boxes. Later, I talked to Robert Liberty about this, and he said that that in the old building that he was in, that in the summertime, they had enormous DC fields because of the return current. So that's another thing to be concerned about. If you have to move, you don't know what the environmental conditions are. And so this really sensitizes to the ambient fields. Here is the hydrogen resonance that Angelus found, and it was really a striking that there's this, right in the middle where you'd expect the biggest effect, there's essentially no effect. We haven't explained that. I'll have something here I can go further. Let me keep moving along. We had a postdoc in the lab with Xin Wang who did some work. I'm going late because I'm taking too long, so let me go on. We also had Andrew Wood spent sort of a sabbatical time in our lab, and when he went back, he got a hold of Colin Thompson and colleagues, Yang and Anderson was here, and they developed a model based on cooperative processes where they could explain some of our data points, which was actually quite striking. And that's a clue. I mean, that there's more work that could be done here to try to develop that. And that was the publication in BIOEMS. Bill Joins, this is now in addition to EPA, Bill Joins, electrical engineer at Duke, is absolutely critical to my work because he's the one that resolved why we had changing power windows when we had different numbers of samples inside our system. And more particularly, what he did was he converted to the fields, rather than the incident fields, he converted to the fields he would predict at the surface of the brain tissue in the test tubes. And he did that, and afterwards when we looked at our 50 megahertz carrier frequency, amplitude modulated at 16 hertz, 147, and then Ross 80 published 450 megahertz work. The power densities did not line up. These windows were not anywhere near resembling any coincidence. So Bill took his model and he just calculated the electric field of the brain tissue in each one of these carrier frequencies, and the windows lined up. So that was wonderful. And then Janie Page was an electrical engineer, and she helped me understand. She disentangled Lednev's mathematical predictions and produced equations and spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheets, so that we could actually provide, utilize the models. And then she found out that our data would not fit Lednev's model. And so she developed a heuristic model that would be more consistent with our data. And Bingy was also very helpful when Lednev didn't like what he thought we had said, and so he helped me with some. I had logical arguments, and he had hard mathematical information to say yes, our exposure system was working properly. Here is the trace of one of our cells. This is with PC12 cells. And you can see that as you start on the left and move to the right, you can see that there's no change for a while before it drops down. And that initial delay looks like, Janie noticed this, it looks just like what you do for hydrogen at this particular frequency index that we used. And where it starts to drop off, and then you see that little notch where it comes up, that's the hydrogen component. And then the resonance with the magnesium and the manganese take over. So it looks like there's a combination of having to displace the hydrogen a little bit before you started seeing the magnesium and manganese. This needs to be followed up by people. We weren't able to do that. I had critics. Okay, let's go through critics. Myers and Ross produced a review and critique, and I was quite annoyed with it, and so I put it down, and after a month I went back and I thought, well, there are some things that we could do to improve, but I don't think their criticism is valid, at least with the work we were doing. And so we repeated things, and we offset the densities a little bit, and so we repeated our 2 intensity windows that we had originally gotten, and we decided, well, let's go a little further. And we would not have done this without the motivation from their critique, and we found 6 power density windows, which were quite revealing in terms of the relational properties. And we also had a critic, which is Robert Adair, and as a physicist, and he just would not acknowledge that biological systems might respond to a physical agent in ways that he couldn't understand. And so that's just what that did is provided the incentive for me to be selective on which physicists to engage for assistance. So that's that. So we also had, as critics, the DOE Tiger review team. They provided critiques to the DOE project manager. And they asked probing questions, they suggested tests, and they helped. They confirmed that, yes, the instrumentation was working correctly and so forth. And one time when they came every year to 2 years, so 18 months. And they ganged up on me. There were 4 of them this one time. It was like the 3rd time they visited. They ganged up on me, and they had this one guy from Sloan Kettering Cancer Research Institute, and that I didn't know, very pleasant and articulate. And so then suddenly I recognized that I'm in a small room, and I said, well, and he's out talking to my technician. I said, all right, fine. And so we just chatted away, and it was quite some time before he came back, and they understood that I knew what was going on, and they were a little concerned that they had pulled this game with me, but so when he came back, they said, well, how'd it go? And the man said, oh, this work is perfect. There is no possible way she could understand what's going on and what to predict. She'd have to be an idiot savant. And that's what they said. And so then everything got very, very relaxed. So apparently they were told, make sure that there's not something jerry-rigged going on here. So that was a really good, that worked out very well. Now, my other critics that I'm going to belabor this just a little bit, the physicists who won't acknowledge the adjective heuristic because it doesn't fit their story. And Lednev and some others didn't understand that we weren't really criticizing his theory. It's just that we're only saying that our data just didn't fit it. And so when we published, this is the paper we published, and you can see that the title is in the second line. And that title did have, when we initially submitted it, the words application of a heuristic ion paramagnetic resonance model. And we were told by the editor, who's in the room, that the title is too long and take out heuristic. And so we thought, all right, we will. Because the last sentence in the abstract says, while the fundamental basis of this model are supported by a variety of other studies, the IPR model is necessarily heuristic when applied to biological systems. In the model limitations section, we say, we emphasize that the proposed model is heuristic at best until the details, blah, blah, blah. And then in a summary, we say the model is necessarily heuristic. Now, in case they didn't have this available at the time, but here is the wiki definition of heuristic, right? And it refers to experience-based techniques for problem solving, learning, and discovery that give a solution which is not guaranteed to be optimal, but it's used to speed up the process of finding a satisfactory solution. Now, why did we use heuristic, and what's the big deal here? Well, when you look at the data, what we have here is data points. There are about 118 data points plotted. The blue line, which is the IPR model, which is something Janie devised, follows it relatively well. It predicts things relatively well. Now, Lednev's model is the other line, which is the green line, and it doesn't work as well. Now, why, as a physicist, you'd want to say, yeah, but the Lednev model is right. So twist your biological data so that it will fit it? I'm sorry. So therefore, that's why you've got to be careful about the physicists you talk to. You know, it's obvious here that something's going on that needs to be explored, and the Lednev model, which is the real physics, needs to be modified. And why and how, you just don't know. So, okay, circumstances, let's see. We had funding when we started in 1972, which was it was one every year, right at the end of the year. Beginning in 79 to 82, we had really good funding. This has to do principally with presidential elections and who's in charge. But in 1983, you might remember that President Reagan took office in 1982, and we had Star Wars coming on. Now, I'm not saying this has anything to do with it, but that's a coincident in time, at least. Our funding went from $3 million and 28 positions to $1.5 million and 16 positions in 84, and it zeroed out in February of 86. Other civilian agencies were also cut back, but not nearly as extreme as EPA. Now I'm going to talk about what I'll call a conundrum, which is that we were using rat liver cells in culture to look at chemicals that the EPA was interested in for a gap junction communication assay. And gap junctions were important in tumor promotion, so that's why it was justified. And we discovered that one chemical, chlorohydrate, sensitized the cells and sensitized the gap junction communication to EMF. And so our results were very similar to the neurite outgrowth assay, which we had reported and published. So we represented this work at BIOEMS and at DOE meetings. And this is an old slide, so I'm sorry I can't improve it. But what you see superimposed here is the PC12 cell data superimposed on top of the gap junction communication data, which is a dye transfer system. And you can see that they're relatively similar. And so this was really delightful, I thought. And then I got a call from a DOE meeting scientist. He was funded through the ELF work. Said, you know, his research is not going very well, and he wondered whether he could see if we could replicate our work. So we sent him cells. He got it, and he called me back a couple of weeks later and said, well, he can't get the TPA results that we published. This is, we published in work that we were doing for the chemical interactions, because we published several papers there. And so I sent him new cells, and what he did was he took the medium from the flasks that were shipped across country, because he was on the West Coast, and saved it. And then he grew our cells in the medium that we sent him. And he was able to reproduce the TPA results. And then, as he grew more with his own presumably identical medium from Gibco, the TPA results went away. And so we just decided that, I joked that it was the pollution on the West Coast that was the problem, but it didn't fit all the data. And then about 10 months later, our cells became more sensitive to chlorohydrate. So we got new cells from ATCC. Initially they gave the early results, and then they got more sensitive as they grew. So we had to reduce the concentration of chlorohydrate, and when we did that, the effect from fields was dramatically smaller, and we could no longer get statistically significant results. And since we couldn't reproduce that data, we've never published any work on the gap junctions changes with the PC12 cells. And then much later, I decided, well, I couldn't figure out what was going on. This is crazy. And it turns out that our original supply of medium and serum were in glass bottles. Now those took up a lot of space in the incubator and in a cold room and so forth. And the new supply came in plastic bottles. So I thought, oh, aha. So we got a hold of the analytical chemistry group, and they detected plasticizers in the medium. And so at subsequent gap junction meetings, which is outside of EPA, outside of electromagnetic fields, this was our other work, at posters, I would ask people whether they had any experience. And I had one German scientist. I had his picture, but I forgot to bring it with me, so it's not here. Maybe you can see who it was. He said that they had in their hospital, they had an assay that would go, it took 5 days to start to finish. And suddenly it changed, and it was working in 3 days. And they couldn't use it. And he thought that was about the time when Gibco changed their sources from Germany to Ireland. And in Ireland, they set up a whole new procedure, and I assume the hypothesis I have is that, well, that's where plastic started. So all the work that you're doing now with plastic bottles have been distorted and will not necessarily repeat the work that was done with medium and glass. So don't be worried about it, because there's nothing you can do. Cash, okay. Internal funding, we had to retool, we got DOE money, and had the 5-year program. So, but now, so I had two 5-year support to the bottom component here. And it turns out that in the last year, all of DOE's funding was killed in this area. Now, since it was 2-year money when it came to EPA, I had money to fund me the last year. But I've been in 2 programs now that have been zeroed out of the US government budget. Either bad or good karma, depends on what you're. Okay, I've had some supporters. Dan Cahill was one of them. And he allowed me to get the air conditioning in my laboratory so that I could have steady temperature throughout the year. And then I could actually I could test whether the calcium efflux from the chick brain tissues, what would happen if I had a plateau of temperature. The temperature did not change during the 20-minute exposure. And that allowed us to show that at 38 degrees C, there was no change by fields. At 37 and 36, fields did have a change, but at 35, there was no change again. And that indicated to me that there was perhaps a phase change that was involved. You needed to have a phase change occurring so that you had sensitivity to the low-intensity fields. Eleanor Dare and I met on a bus at the 1979 NERC meeting. We were going out to a chateau, and we just happened to be in adjoining seats in the bus. And so we had a 2-hour bus ride talk. And she really liked the calcium efflux work that I was doing and the approach I was taking. She didn't particularly care for Ross 80s. They had a personality interaction that was not as good. And but Eleanor said that she would defend me in front of anyone if the subject came up about the work I was doing. So I felt at this time in my career, in 1979, this was really a very supportive thing to have just somebody totally outside the group that would be supportive. Also, I had support from Hermann Schwann. The first interaction I had with him was in 1984 when he asked me to go to lunch when we were at a NATO Advanced Studies workshop in Arice. And I had just presented data showing that the Earth's magnetic field was involved in selecting which frequencies would work. Well, he had his own little scheme. He thought that the walls of the TEM cells were sort of vibrating a little bit. And that's what was causing the resonant curves with different intensities. And he was really pushing me to change the dielectric constants in the air between the systems. So, and I had not yet told him about my need to control the temperature. And so I thought, well, I said, I will do this if you can tell me how the Earth's magnetic field is involved with these ponderomotive forces. Now, he had invited me there, And he had a friend that he would talk German with, and then he'd turn back to me, and then he'd be talking to. So he looked at me, and he just glared at me, and it seemed like it was a half an hour he glared at me, but it was probably only 45 seconds to a minute. And then he didn't say anything. He started talking to the German guy in German, and then he turned back to me and he said, "You know, you're right." So that was my interaction with him until 1989, when we were both at a Stockholm meeting, and we're out on a deck having a coffee break, and he came up to me and he said, "You know, Carl," he said a number of things, but he said, "You know, I really hope you're able to continue your research, because I think your results could be very useful and important." So that's my interaction with another Darson Ball winner, as well as Eleanor Adair. And Tom Rizal was very supportive. He invited me to help, through Alan Fry, to attend meetings where Bioelectromagnetics Society was formulated. And then he kept me on his peer review panel for the 10 years of duration of the panel, which I really appreciated. Okay, I'm about to end, but I've got a couple slides. The future. I think that genetic susceptibilities may be something that really needs to be looked at. Now, let me review some of the background information for this. And I became really aware of this at IARC in 2001 with the ELF evaluation that was going on. I was chair of the mechanisms section, so every day, twice a day, the chairs would meet to find out what were going on in the other sessions and offer advice and so forth. And there was a controversy that arose between the Leveson-Loescher work results published and then the Larry Anderson results. Anderson's results could not replicate the Leveson-Loescher results. And Larry Anderson was on the mechanisms group, so I know he was going off, and there was a big argument. They couldn't agree on how to evaluate the work, so that the declaration at the end was based almost exclusively on the very strong human epidemiological data that classified as a 2B carcinogen. The animal work really had very little impact. At least that's my memory of it. So as a consequence of that meeting, Anderson and Loescher got together and they published a paper together describing all of the differences. And the most prominent one was that there was a higher sensitivity to the initiating agent in Anderson's group. So then, by that time, Mikey had moved on, and Fedorowicz and Loescher repeated the exposures, and with the original rat strain, and then with a strain that was more sensitive to the initiating agent. And indeed, the one that was more sensitive to the initiating agent was not affected, but their old strain was effective. And so what this did is this identified a genetic sensitivity, a genetic difference underlying this enhanced sensitivity. And so in continuation of this rat strain sensitivity issue, it was quite interesting that the sensitive rat strain that Loescher's group had been using was discontinued by the supplier. Well, the supplier was purchased by an international vivarium company, and they just decided to discontinue this one. So Maren Fedorowicz tested for inbred and for outbred strains using a shorter term test, and she found one of the strains was almost as sensitive as the old German one, and it turns out to be the Fisher 344, so it's not an exotic strain. It was well used. And she continued some work, and then it was suspended, and I don't know whether she's returned to that, because if you do what you can do with the funding. There were two other studies that I think are exploratory studies, and they just hint at things. And that is, there was a study out of China in 2008 that looked at children with deficiencies in a repair gene, the XRCC1, and it's got some letters after it. And what they noticed was that a subset of the children had childhood leukemia. So the investigator went to the home environments to try to see whether there was anything there in the home that would they could correlate with the induced cancer. And what they found was higher EMF exposures. And so this is it's an observation. It's a clue. Another one that came out in 2007 was from Mexico, and children with Down syndrome have increased incidence of childhood leukemia. And they went to the homes, and they found that at and above 6 milligauss, there was increased incidence of leukemia. And so that's published. Now, these are small pilot studies that just say that maybe something more thorough should be done. Now, in vitro studies, I was doing a review on genetics, and I came up with an Egyptian paper that claimed that white blood cells from people that were donors, but they were not described, had higher micronuclei formation if they were subjected to pulsed power line fields. And it was interesting, but not enough detail. But when Maria Scarfi did her work, she had children with Turner syndrome, and they had increased micronuclei formation if the fields were pulsed, but not if they were CW. And so the value of the current data set is that it's sufficiently puzzling that more laboratory research should be conducted to confirm and define the ELF conditions that produce the effects. New research should optimize the EMF parameters to reduce maximal changes. And these studies should combine exposures with conditions for in utero exposure as well, or incubator conditions to optimize, to get the effects as large as they can. And in terms of susceptibilities in utero, we had our chicken eggs experiments, which produced, if the eggs were exposed to 50 hertz, the brain tissues responded differently to the calcium efflux than if the eggs were exposed during incubation to 60 hertz fields. And there is one report out of Lee in 2011 who showed that he's been following in utero exposure or early childhood exposures to see what happens in later life. And this was women who were pregnant with pulsed EMF exposed fields and following the children. And in this particular report, he describes increased incidences of asthma in the children whose mothers were exposed to in higher pulsed magnetic fields. So I think that the last slide basically is that the genetic susceptibilities and this EHS, it seems to me it's impossible that it is possible that people who claim to be electromagnetically hypersensitive are truly affected by some EMF. And I've talked to 3 people personally whose descriptions of their EHS history appear plausible and deserve to be examined. But such individuals should be tested with proper experimental design with their input into what the design should be, and then also genetically tested for EMF sensitivity. I emphasize that their input because one of them told me that he volunteered for an evaluation, and when he actually got there to sign on a dotted line, they told him what the experiment was going to be, and he said, "I'm not going to be sensitive to that." And he rejected it. And so I got that from him. I don't know what the experimental designs are, but they need to be designed by people who truly understand the circumstances. So I want to thank you for the honor I've received. I'm receiving it based on all the contributions that were made from everyone else as well. And I hope that this talk has stimulated your interest to continue exploring new vistas in the bioelectromagnetics research. Okay, there, thank you. And I've just discovered I have a pin. Thank you.
I don't know if the microphone is working. So thank you, Carl, for this very interesting story with many twists and many characters. And you may have enough for a TV show, maybe. So I'm sure you will have some questions from the audience before we follow up on the next things in the meeting. So, would anyone have a question for Carl? Yes, Lloyd?
Robert Liberty was an investigator out in California at LBL, and he was funded by DOE. And so what would happen, Emery Jouk would get us together at the Department of Energy contractors review meetings, all the people he had funded, and would have us interact and be supportive. And this is where I found out about Robert's mu metal boxes and how he had resolved the issue. And I thought this was absolutely the way to go. And so we had those made for us. And he also had some work with MCF7 cells, which showed that he had increased effect of fields on the melatonin suppression of growth. The fields removed it. And he had circumstances where he had moved down from up on the hill at Lawrence Berkeley, where Tom 1040 had a group, down to an area much closer to the highway, actually, and flat, and without the strong ground currents going through his laboratory. And so he was doing more work. And the division director there really wanted them to do more work that would support her work. And he was less compliant than I would have been. And so she really got aggravated with that, and let's say made it more difficult for him to stay. And it got to be a very ugly situation. And there were claims that he manipulated data and he distorted it. And so I was one of the people that he asked to review it for his legal team. And I looked at it and I didn't see anything that was gross distortion. And I got a call from folks up in NIH who were involved with research integrity. And they wanted me to come up, and I said, no, I don't have time. You come down if you want to. And they resolved it they resolved the circumstances out of, I didn't get involved. But my sense was that this was done in June of one year. And in September of that year, Donna Shalala removed the authority to take people out of the lab and declare them as irresponsible when obviously just if Robert had been able to hang on for longer, I think he would have still had a research program. But I don't know if that's what you're talking about or not, but that's what comes to me when you ask the question. Well, I can't address, I can only address what I know.
Okay, thank you. We had another question here, yeah.
I can't, sorry.
In your paper you published on 50 and 60 hertz. I'm just asking a sort of devil question. Is it safer to live in America or South Africa?
You know, that's an interesting question. And I'm not sure where it is. So I will tell you what I've heard, and this is anecdotal reports. And that is that a man in London was asked to go into a sanitarium where people who were hypersensitive to things, you know, some people can get allergic to perfumes and to paints and to various aromas, and they were sent to the sanitarium and to stay away from all stimuli, basically. And the clinicians there noticed that some of the people, a subcategory of the people, were responding to electrical storms, you know, when there were lightning and thunderstorms. And so he came in with a function generator, with a wire, and he actually tested the patients with different frequencies. And I mean, I said anecdotal because this is what I was told. This is what, and what I heard in actually in a presentation at FDA. And he found that each individual was responsive to 50 hertz fields. This is London, okay? Except for one person. And then to higher frequencies, they all had different frequency patterns that they were responsive to. When he came back 2 weeks later, they repeated their experiments, and their patterns repeated for sensitivity. So they got with the clinicians to find out what the history of these people were. And 9 out of the 10 were born in the UK, and one of them was born in Boston, Massachusetts. And so that suggests, at least, that if you look at the environment that was around during embryogenesis and early childhood, you can see that there were fields in the environment that, if the story is correct, may have been imprinted on the people. And so that was independent of my question about 50 hertz and 60 hertz with our chicken egg experiments. And so I think that there may be hidden imprints in all of us for what we experienced when we're young, and they'll never be expressed except under strange circumstances. I don't know any more than that. I mean, this is speculation.
Thank you, Carl. I think we'll have to close. We have the tea and coffee waiting for us outside, and we have to move on. I think, Carl, you're available to anyone for discussion. Thank you very much, and congratulations again. So the session is closed.